Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Dan Welch. I'm a Solutions Fellow with the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES, and welcome to our webinar on electric school buses called Green Buses, Healthy Children, The Road to Electrified School Buses. This will be a one-hour panel discussion on how electric school buses can improve health impacts on children and their communities, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and also provide information on how fleet managers can manage new costs and locate savings associated with the new electric school bus technologies. Joining me on this call will be Dr. Barbara Weller, Manager of Population Studies with the California Air Resources Board, Jenna Van Harpen, Director of Alternative Fuels at Bluebird Bus Company, and Kevin Matthews, the Managing Director of Energy and Environment for National Strategies. A few quick notes about the webinar. This is being recorded. The recording will be emailed out, I believe, tomorrow. And we will be hosting a question and answer session at the end of the webinar in about 35, 40 minutes. If you have any questions during or at any time, you can put those into the chat box on your right. So very quickly, a few pieces of information about C2ES. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank based in the DC area. We work directly with cities, states, and businesses to develop pragmatic, cost-effective, and flexible climate solutions. And we're proud to say that the UPenn survey came out, I believe, last year, the annual rankings, and we were ranked number 4 again, as we were last year. So we're proud of the work we do here. And we are dedicated to working with our business community. So this is a listing of the companies in our Business Environment Leadership Council. And they're mostly large Fortune 500 companies that regularly communicate with us about new ideas of ours and theirs, market developments, and strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So this is to say that our interactions with business aren't lip service. We are really dedicated to that proposition. So just a quick word about how we got into this topic of electric school buses. So in the immediate aftermath of the Volkswagen settlement, we put together a fact sheet that's available on our website at this address here. We also then hosted a follow-up webinar last fall that focused on how cities and states and businesses can get involved with the funding process. A very quick update to that funding process that you should know about if you weren't already familiar. For beneficiaries, the timeline has been extended to an extent that there's no hard deadline anymore for when beneficiaries have to submit their proposals. Instead, beneficiaries may submit their plans 30 days before their first funding requests. So that is one small but important update, but not necessarily why we're here. So we had discussions about the Volkswagen funding with cities about how to use that, and we found that they expressed some pretty great interest in electric school buses. So with that, we then developed a brief on electrified transportation with a focus on equitable distribution and social justice. And that's listed at this link here, and that's the header from the brief for a splash of color at the bottom. But the idea was that we wanted to start the conversation of how to expand the benefits of electrification, such as reduced criteria air pollutants or inexpensive electricity for fuel, to low-income communities that may not be able to afford new cars or may not have access to charging stations. And one of those strategies was electric school buses, a way to reduce harmful criteria air pollutants in neighborhoods that may have high exposure, or to improve the safety of children. And then lastly, since we are aiming to provide government agencies and fleet managers with a better understanding of how and why to adopt ZEV school buses, I just want to share with you a sense of where cities are with AFV adoption. So in 2017, we put together a survey through the Alliance for a Sustainable Future, which is a partnership with several large companies and the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And nearly 100 cities responded to this survey. As you can see in the second bullet, nearly 90% are involved with either currently or planning in the immediate future to purchase AFVs, and that's shown on the chart on the right. And I think that demonstrates that there's a great appetite for adopting AFVs, even if it's not happening right now. The different colors on the right show that there are a range of cities between small and large that are involved too, so it's not just the largest cities in the world that are doing this. And then lastly, cities and businesses mentioned that they were working with their states to find funding, such as through VW or other processes to fund these things. So the process is well underway. So with that, I thank you for your attention. My email address is at the bottom here if you have any questions, as well as my colleague who worked with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Amy Bailey. And I'll then cut to Dr. Barbara Weller, who will tell you a little bit about the need to reduce diesel emissions on populations. Barbara?
Hi, this is Barbara Weller with the California Air Resources Board. And I didn't put my email address on my slide, so it's simply barbara.weller@arb.ca.gov. Next slide. So can you hear me? Okay, good.
I can hear you.
So the outline of what I'm going to talk about today is just go over some of the health impacts of exposure to ambient pollution, briefly talk about some studies that have looked at exposure on school buses, look at some of the health benefits that have been seen when improvements are made to school buses, and talk about some of the health benefits of regulations that have been seen in studies, and finish up with some exposure mitigations. Next slide. So when you think about air pollution and diesel air pollution in particular, it's really a component of regional, local, and ultimately a personal exposure. So you can have fairly good regional air quality, and yet you can, within that region, have localized what we call hotspots, or areas where the air pollution can be very high, particularly near roadways. But the thing to remember is all of our exposure is at a personal level. It's what we do in our day that causes us to have our total exposure. And oftentimes our commute on roadways is really the source of most of the air pollution that we receive in the day. And this can be true for children with their school bus commute as well. Next slide. So when you think about air pollution exposures and the health impacts, some of you may be familiar with cardiovascular mortality seen in adults that is associated with air pollution. I'm concentrating here on the effects seen in children and infants. And you'll notice that I've divided this into particulate matter, traffic, and toxics. And that's the reason for that is that diesel really contributes to all of these areas. So particulate matter has been very extensively studied, and diesel is a contributor to particulate matter pollution. And you can see some of the effects there in children, respiratory effects and asthma effects. Lung function growth reduction. This is a way of looking at lung function growth in children. So they measure the lung function in the children over time. It's a way of looking at how their lungs grow. And they found that particulate matter reduces growth in children. It's also a risk of low birth weight, so a risk in the very young and in infant mortality. Traffic pollution studies that have been done have found that the strongest association is with exacerbation of asthma symptoms. Now, this is actually a causal association, which means it's very, very strongly associated. When you think about asthma in children, there's a huge burden to the family as well as to the child. So this is a physical burden, this is a financial burden, and a stress for the family. Healthcare utilization costs, and also children missing school. So this is really a very important factor, the fact that traffic pollution really is associated with exacerbation of asthma. Also associated with asthma prevalence, and that means that there are just more asthmatic kids that are found in areas with high traffic, and of course the decrease in lung function, as well as onset of asthma, which has been seen in traffic pollution. And I have toxics there as well, because remember that the particulate matter acts as almost a carrier. They're very, very small particles that go deep into the lungs. Whatever is on particulate matter, including diesel particulate matter, which, by the way, is listed as a toxic air contaminant by the Air Resources Board, whatever is on the diesel particulate matter is going to be carried down into the lungs and be interacting with the lungs, and that's why the toxics and cancer risk is there, even though we're talking about children. Next slide, please. So when you look at school buses and you look at the pollution inside a school bus cabin, studies have found that you can get 4 times the pollution level inside the cabin that compared to the ambient level, and 2 times what is on the roadway. So what are some of the ways that the pollution gets in? Well, some sources of pollution with school buses is the emissions during idling and startup. Diesel engines really produce a lot of higher emissions during idling and startup. Oftentimes, what is around the bus is going to be a source for the bus. And this is particularly true in older and leaky vehicles. And often the bus in front is actually another school bus. You've probably seen buses caravanning and one school bus right after the other, so they're just setting each other up for that pollution. Obviously, the window position is very important. Open windows is going to increase exposure to whatever is on the roadway. However, closed windows can increase what we call self-pollution, and that is pollution that is in the bus cabin from the engine that is driving that bus. So next slide, please. So when we talk about in-cabin pollution and self-pollution, it's really mainly a factor of bus age, design, and to a certain degree, the maintenance of the bus. It can be engine sourced. Some school buses have the engine located underneath the bus shell. Now, this is astonishing to me, why an engine would be located underneath the shell of a bus, because, obviously that's going to be a source of potential pollution. So, that can come up through the floor of the bus. Older, leakier crankcases are a source of pollution. There have been a number of studies looking at tailpipe sources in buses, and they found that the location is important. The school bus fumes get kind of sucked into the vortex in the back of the bus. So if the tailpipe is located behind the rear axle and exhausted to the side, you tend to get less pollution. And the height of the bus is very important. If you look at school bus tailpipes that are located at the top of the bus, there's less pollution from this, but there is a safety concern because, there's a concern that children could hold on to that pipe. Next slide. So what happens when you improve the technology and improve the fuels with diesel buses? This is a study in the state of Washington that looked at the change in clean fuels and technology over time, and then looked at the health of the children riding these buses to see if they could see an improvement in health with this increase in fuel technology and clean fuels. Now, you'll notice that with the clean fuels and the technology, this lowered the particles by 10 to 50%. And what this tells you is that there's a lot of variability in school bus exposures. There's a lot of variability from one run to another in school bus. And that's because there's so many factors that are involved. The number of children on the bus can actually affect the amount of pollution. The windows open or closed, what's around the bus has an effect. But this study found that if you modified the engines, you saw reduced absenteeism in the children riding those buses, a significant 6% lower absenteeism, as well as improved lung growth. And again, this is lung function growth, reduced inflammation, and these effects were mostly seen in the asthmatic children. If you look at ultra-low sulfur fuel, you saw reduced absenteeism. These effects were a little stronger. There was an 8% lower risk and again, improved lung growth and reduced inflammation. And they extrapolated these findings to the U.S. and calculated that there would be 14 million fewer absentee events per year with the reduction of with the ultra low sulfur fuel in the United States. So again, showing the benefit of reducing pollution on school buses to children's health. Next slide. So when you look at the benefit of regulations in California, there's a study in California called the Children's Health Study that has been ongoing in the Los Angeles area since the early 90s. And this is really a landmark study that has given us a tremendous amount of information about how air pollution impacts children. And this study has found, with all of the regulations enacted by the Air Resources Board and the districts to reduce pollution from vehicles, that there has been a significant improvement in bronchitic symptoms in children in the Los Angeles basin. And in fact, this reduction is seen in children with and without asthma, although the reductions were larger in children with asthma. So this really says something about the improvement in asthma control for children in the area with this reduction in air pollution from the 90s to 2012. They also saw improvement in lung function growth. In fact, it was clinically significant improvement. We're talking about the children that have the lowest of the lung function parameters, and there was a reduction in those numbers of children. When you think about lung function growth, this just doesn't have an effect that is immediate on the children. This is something that is really lifelong. It's been associated with risk of lung disease and also risk of difficulties later in life. And they've done studies in the Children's Health Study and found that the lung function growth doesn't really catch up. So this is very important that they're actually seeing improvements with the reduction in air pollution due to controls. So again, points out the fact that if you reduce children's exposure, you do improve their health. Next slide. So what can we do? What are some further actions? Well, obviously this idea of one bus after another is a very bad idea. And I think that, a lot of time has been spent to make sure that people are aware of that. Reducing idling is important, and in fact, there's a regulation in California to reduce idling in schools because, children might be waiting for buses, and you can have this long line of buses producing a lot of pollution as children are standing there waiting to get on and off of the bus. The California Air Resources Board supports safe routes to schools. And this is getting rid of the buses altogether, get the children off the bus. Now, obviously, this is not practical in all solutions, but this is something to think about when schools are being planned, because not only do you have a reduction in pollution, but in addition, the children are going to be more physically active, and they've done studies, and children that bike and ride to school have lower obesity and overweight. And obesity and overweight in children is really an epidemic in the United States. So anything that we can do to help in that area is important. Now, as far as bus designs are concerned, additional improvements for diesel buses, you can always go CNG. There is a concern about formaldehyde with CNG. A study that was done by the Air Resources Board looking at installing high efficiency in-cabin air filters found that you can remove up to 50% of the particles in the cabin with these filters. And that's important because that could be put on any bus. Because even a very clean bus with the windows down, you're going to get the pollution coming in from the outside. So I think that that's something that can be thought about. And then, of course, you can go electric, and that is what we're going to be hearing more about today. And if you want any additional information, please see our website.
Thank you, Barbara. That was terrific. When I had asked for your contributions, I suppose I was unprepared for exactly how in detail a doctor could get. That was really wonderful. Thank you. Um, so I would also encourage you to the audience to put in questions on the chat bar on the right if you have anything you'd like to ask. We'll have time at the end, and then to tell us a little bit about the bus maker Bluebird's new line and the potential market for the all-electric buses. We're being joined by Jenna Van Harpen. Jenna?
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dr. Barbara. That was amazing. So I want to talk to you guys today about our newest line of the Bluebird electric school bus. So you can go to the next slide. So many of you may or may not know, but back in '94, Bluebird actually came to market with an electric school bus. The battery technology wasn't quite there yet. You guys can remember back to the first iPhone, and now we're on, the iPhone 10. So technology has really changed and made it able for us to come out with a bus that's zero emissions, reducing maintenance costs for the fleet managers and school districts, and go further. The big question is range, and I'll address that later in the presentation. But now the V2G technology is there as well. You can go to the next slide. So as Dr. Barbara just mentioned, it's good for the children riding the buses, but it's also good for the communities, the parents, the local governments that are around the school districts as well. I'm sure many of you have seen how the school buses line up every morning and afternoon to pick those children up. So this way, with an electric school bus, we are emitting zero emissions. The reduced maintenance costs. Diesel buses have become very costly to work on with the after treatment systems. In a start-stop application, they're just not meant in that duty cycle, and there's more maintenance that is required on a diesel bus. And then school districts, there are lots of grants out there that make this possible for districts to apply, and then reducing up to 90% of their fuel costs. Now we're talking about electricity versus fuel in the ground. Next slide. So the most common comments that we get today are the buses are very expensive. These have a lot of batteries, and they're going to be expensive to replace, and they don't have sufficient range. Well, I'm going to tell you we can overcome just about all of those. And in this presentation, it is very affordable for a school district, and I know Kevin's going to get into more of the grants and how that works, but we'll talk about the technology. Next slide, please. So the cost, as mentioned, and I won't say too much because I know Kevin's going to get into more detail, but many of the states have pilot programs going on to help school districts purchase an electric school bus. So we launched these school buses last July. You can actually order a school bus today. Delivery will be at the end of this summer of 2018. But the simplicity of it, and we're out there educating districts now because it is hard to change. You don't have any of the maintenance items you do today on a current diesel. Go ahead to the next slide. I'll show you guys. So the battery technology, we actually utilize 2 sets of batteries. There's 7 in each set, so 14 total. These batteries are lithium ion, so they will last longer. We are offering a 5-year warranty as the standard option. We are looking at the extended warranty right now. But the important part is we will have up to 150 kilowatt on board, providing up to 100-mile range on a single charge. And the reason I say up to 100-mile range is drivers are very dependent on this range. If any of you are familiar of driving a diesel bus, there is a lag when you step on the pedal. When you step on an electric bus gas pedal, you will take off instantly. So it's a direct drive system. So we educate the drivers on how to actually drive these school buses so that the district actually gets the longest range out of a single charge. Next slide, please. So when you look at the range, and this is important because 100 miles on a single charge actually covers 80% of the school bus routes today. And that's considering an overnight charge to have, a full charge for the next day. But if you perform a midday charge, you're actually going to be covering up to 90% of the routes today. So if they drive, say 80 miles on their first route, you do a midday charge and we can get you that 80 miles for the second route, the midday route. So there is ability to do a midday charge, although we are saying that it is driver dependent to get up to that 100-mile range. Next slide. So as technology has changed, we also have onboard software where you can actually purchase this software with the bus that you can monitor everything from the office. So you can figure out where the bus is, telematics, location, start, stop, performance of the vehicle, look how the driver is actually driving it. So it's very interesting on how technology has really changed. And you can see that you're getting the best driving out of each bus, each route. Sorry. Next slide. So the different modes, and this actually is not something that the driver has to switch on and off. It happens automatically as they figure out, as the bus figures out the route, it'll actually switch into hill mode if you're going to go up a hill. So that'll take a little bit more energy. Then we have the Eco EV mode, which is really the standard driving mode every day. It'll stay in there until you pull up to a hill, and then it'll go into the hill mode. And then we also have the regenerative braking mode. So as in an electric car, when you step off the gas pedal, it starts regenerative braking or regenerative energy back into the batteries. Next slide. So the charging system of the vehicle is actually a level 2 connector, which provides an overnight charge. We are looking into the fast charge systems, but for the industry standard, an overnight charge has been sufficient for a school district. Again, this will also plug in during the day to get you that secondary charge if need be. Next slide. And this is an underbody view because safety is the most important thing to us on a school bus. And the batteries are located between the frame rail, which is the safest place on a school bus. So if there was an accident, they are very well protected. Again, there's 2 sets of 7 running along the frame rail there. Next slide. And what I wanted to really mention is we do have a demo bus that is floating around the United States. We did a road show with 8 events in California. It made its way to Arizona, on its way to Washington and Oregon, and then it's making its way east. So if you're interested in learning where any of those events are, my email address and phone number are here. And we would love to have you guys attend and actually drive or ride the bus, as that's the best experience to see really how this works. So with that, Dan, back to you.
Thank you, Jenna. I really appreciated the details that you gave there. We're very much looking forward to the 2018 lines coming out. So to take us to the next speaker, Kevin Matthews from National Strategies will be then telling us about some of his experiences operating a pilot project in California to deploy school buses and some of the cost-saving techniques he's developed. Kevin?
Thanks, Dan, very much, and thanks to you and C2S for hosting this conference today. It's an important and emerging area, and it's great to get information out there, and really privileged to be on the call with Barbara and Jenna as well. So I'm going to go through some real-world experiences and real numbers that exist around operating electric school buses, as well as some emerging areas that we'll be looking into as well. just so you know, the cover page here, the bus on your right, the bus we're talking about. Those in the know, that's a 1996 Bluebird International body. We retrofitted it, but that exists today and has been operating for a couple of years in California with 5 of its cousins. So Dan, you want to take us to the next page? So I'll go through background on the program, the pilot program that was conducted in California, and then we'll move into our analysis of the total cost of ownership, and then step into infrastructure and charging considerations that you might want to be even looking at as early as today, even before you buy your first school bus, as well as how to be planning for down the road, and then mentioning some of the grant funds that are out there at this point in time that you can take advantage of. Next slide. So the school bus project we did started in 2013, which we call the phase 1 project at this point, was really, there was a group of companies and organizations that understood that electric school buses would be coming. There were none commercially available, but knew they would be coming and knew that cost would be the issue, not technology. The ability to make electric vehicles go 80 miles a day, which is the national school bus average, we knew was capable, but was how to make them cost affordable for school districts to own and operate. And it was also about that time that this concept of vehicle to grid, V2G, actually became a reality. And for those unfamiliar with vehicle to grid, that's so when the bus is parking idle or any vehicle, it can actually take the energy left in its battery and sell that electricity back to the utility grid, thereby earning income, or offset the cost of the facility where the school bus is run, the electricity cost around that. And so that was some of the real things that came around that began to make the reality that an economically viable school bus was in the very near term. So the scope of our project was to build and deploy 6 vehicle-to-grid enabled Type C school buses, which you saw on the cover slide there. 2 each were placed in the Torrance, Napa Valley, and Edison school districts in California, and they've been operating for up to a year at this point in time. And if you would like to see those, or if you're in California and want to do that, we can work that out. All 6 happen to be back in Escondido, California at this time at TransPower, the company that did the work for us. They're doing some upgrades to them, but they'll be back in the field by April and back and running in that regard. So the project elements, the buses were equipped with a bidirectional inverter, and that's what allows the vehicle-to-grid communication to go on. That takes electricity and sends electricity back to the grid, and so that's an important element within the study. We also looked at around the charging infrastructure issues that would be associated with school buses, and then what it took to actually interconnect with the utility. That's a very different issue from just plugging in and receiving electricity from a utility, sending it back. Takes another level of interconnection agreements, and then looking at the charge discharge control system and how that would work. I want to make sure to give thanks to the people who funded this project for us. It was the California Energy Commission, the South Coast Air Quality Management District, as well as NRG EVgo for about a $3.6 million project in total. Next slide. So what did we learn over the first year of this project as the buses operated? Well, first is we easily satisfied the range and duty cycle requirements for the school buses, for the fleets where they were deployed. Was not an issue at any point in time. The second thing, high driver satisfaction. They really enjoy driving these vehicles. And as Jenna was clear to point out, it's a different experience when you step on that accelerator to make the bus go, but also different decelerating because you're not applying the brake near as much. You're just lifting up off the accelerator to take advantage of the regenerative braking issue. Another lesson learned was retrofits. I know some people are looking at that. Very difficult, creates different issues, some things we weren't particularly expecting within that. One of the issues was really around noise, both audible, so the bus was louder because you had a transmission system that was designed to be covered by a diesel engine, and now you had different sounds coming from that transmission, which were kind of annoying, but you normally wouldn't hear them over a diesel engine. And then we had electronic noise, which really created issues in the communication software between the bus, the charger, and the grid issue. And a lot of that was just around grounding and older buses. And so it's not as easy to do a retrofit as some might think it would be. Utilities, they actually really want to work with you. I know there are horror stories out there about working with utilities and trying to do projects. I will say all the ones we worked with really put in a time and effort to make this project work. But again, it took extra time because everything was different about this project. One of our better results out of this was a higher expected efficiency at 1.14 kilowatts per mile. You'll get used to that. As opposed to MPG, you want a lower number. So if you can go south of 1.4, you're actually being more efficient. And we were really, really pleased to be at 1.4 kilowatts per mile for the weight vehicle we have there. And again, the results led to the creation of a phase 2 project. Very proud to be in partnership with Bluebird and Jenna and her team and the U.S. Department of Energy, where we're now creating, as Jenna said, that really fully functional vehicle-to-grid bus and what that will mean. Next slide. So here we're going to talk about some of the numbers that came out of the study and what this means for those who operate school buses. Now, I want to be clear, while I said these numbers are reality, there's one that's not reality today, and that's the $230,000 to purchase an EV school bus. So please don't call Jenna asking for the $230,000 school bus. It doesn't exist. But that's a number that will exist at a certain production run, annual production run by the manufacturers. And fortunately, the VW settlement, we think, will get us a long, long, long way toward that number. So as you begin to see here, compare the initial purchase price of a diesel versus an EV. Then you look at the fuel savings, and this is a pretty conservative option even on the fuel price. So you see a pretty significant reduction in what you're going to be paying for fuel. Then the maintenance on the bus is really large savings there. It drops pretty significant. We also, in factoring in the total cost of ownership, we did go ahead and do a fairly conservative estimate that we would have to replace the battery packs at some point in time. And so we built in a price around that and how to accrue for those. And then these are the real world numbers, the $6,100. That's the actual amount of money that one of the school buses was able to generate in this particular case, saving the school district money by operating behind the meter. I want to say the next number down has not included the $9,000 in there, but that's to show the potential. We've now, as our phase 2 work has been getting underway and we've been working through some numbers, we're pretty sure that $9,000 per bus per year will actually be a real opportunity based on the numbers you see over here at $900 per year per 10 kilowatt hours you can bid. And as Jenna was pointing out, they've got a 150 kilowatt battery on that pack. So bidding in 100 kilowatts per year won't be that difficult to do in order to achieve things like that. So what does all this mean? It means that in 13 years, the diesel and the zero-emission school bus are equal in total cost, and that school buses tend to operate 14 to 16 years under current market conditions. Really shows that an EV school bus, even at a higher acquisition cost over a diesel school bus, is going to have a greater cost savings over the life of that bus. Next slide, please. So the other things to consideration for total cost of ownership, because again, some people are still going to look at that and say, wow, $230,000 versus $110,000, that's still too high for us. We've got a capital budget versus an operation and maintenance budget. How can we lower that capital acquisition cost? So some of the things we'll be studying in this phase 2 product is basically a battery not included bus. So you would buy the bus, but the battery would be leased to you as kind of a fuel lease, where you're normally buying fuel. You would be able to, do your electricity and your battery combined as a lease, and that could drop the total cost could drop the acquisition cost and impact overall total cost of operations as well. Other things, again, that slide before did not assume any grant funding, anything to offset the cost of dollars. And those are out there. Plenty of programs exist, and we'll touch on that in a moment. We're also seeing battery costs drop a little faster than what we've been anticipating, and so that will be another thing that will bring down that cost of acquiring and operating an electric school bus. And then one thing we just don't know yet is what's the second life battery market going to be. So once that battery reaches the end of its useful life for propelling a school bus, what's its value going to be in the secondary market in order to make additional revenue from that approach. Next slide, please. Charging and infrastructure consideration. So if you don't leave anything else today and you're a school district on this phone call, very important. If you're going to repave, resurface, or build a new school bus facility, even if you're not considering buying an electric school bus this year, next year, even 5 years from now, run the conduit to each parking space now. It's a 1.5-inch conduit for power and a 1-inch one for telco to go with it. It's the logistics around ripping up a school bus yard to run electricity later and move the buses around can be quite problematic. It's not necessarily a greater cost, but just the logistics are hard. So again, if you're redoing your school bus parking facility, run the conduit now. It doesn't cost that much more just to run a bunch of PVC pipe at this point in time. So the cost of charging infrastructure varies greatly on several different factors. One is the utility territory where your school district is located. In some instances, the utilities are offering to cover all of the charging infrastructure cost. So there would be absolutely no cost at all to doing charging infrastructure. So that's something to explore. Look at what your utilities offering, or a charging company in your area might be offering as well. The second thing is the current electrical system that your school bus facility has. So if you already have electricity run to each parking spot, to do an engine heater or to deal with the diesel particulate filters on the bus, that will really reduce the cost because, again, you've already got electricity run out there. You can take advantage of that system, and that really reduces costs pretty greatly. And then finally, how many buses are you going to charge? Are you just buying 2? Or are you going to do your entire fleet? And that could lead into potential upgrades of the service panel at the school facility itself, and even transmission capability around the school district, around the schoolyard itself. Again, utilities often take care of the transmission side of the equation, but it's something you may have to factor in as well as you do this. So what does this mean? It probably means that, the low end, it's $2,500 per bus simply to put the level 2 charging station if everything's already run out there and you're ready to go. But if you're having to do an entire facility for, upwards of 100, 200 plus buses, you could be looking at $300,000 to $400,000 for an entire facility, including if you're having to do service upgrade and panel upgrades and that type of expense as well. So next slide. So we mentioned when we talk about funds, there is fortunately money out there today to help school districts and school bus operators acquire school buses. You've heard it mentioned a couple of times, the Volkswagen settlement. And if you're an aficionado of the Volkswagen settlement or need to become one, Appendix D is where you want to go, which created a $2.7 billion emissions reduction fund that's basically eligible for Class 4 vehicles and up, and programs that reduce NOx. So all 50 states and tribes get a prorated share of this $2.7 billion. That's been established. Every state knows how much they have. There's a beneficiary set for all states, and now the states are beginning to look at how they're going to divide that money up. Fortunately, within the settlement that the federal government signed with the state of California and Volkswagen, it does allow for zero-emission school buses to be purchased with those funds, and up to 100% of the cost of the bus can be covered using those funds. Now, each state will have a say in how they're going to spend their funds and how much. So some states may come in and say, yes, we'll cover zero-emission school buses, but we're only going to cover up to 20% of the cost, or 50%, or the delta between what a diesel bus would cost and what an electric school bus would cost. But there are a couple of states that are indicating they will go with the full 100% reimbursement. So for a school district, you may be able to actually this year, as Jenna's saying, as their 2018s roll off the model, be able to acquire these buses at absolutely no cost to do that. If you're interested, you should find out in your state who's in charge of the program, the Volkswagen settlement. They're designing their plans now. Make sure you engage with them and actively say you would like the money to be used toward zero-emission school buses and school bus replacement programs. Secondly, there are states that have their own grant programs and subsidy programs that exist to purchase zero-emission vehicles across the board. California and New York have the most significant programs. Barbara's organization, CARB, puts resources out through that, or does it through the air districts through the state. So you should really take an opportunity to look at those, because those exist and can help really reduce that initial acquisition cost. Next slide. So this is me, happy to follow back up with you guys if you have further detailed questions. I know vehicle to grid is something maybe new to a lot of you, lots of details around it, so happy to talk about that in greater detail down the road if somebody would like to do that as well. Thanks, Dan.
Great, thank you so much, Kevin. And as you say, the ability to fund these vehicles could be critically important, at least in the short term. And that actually reminded me that as part of the putting together documents for the electrification for low-income communities brief we put together, I'd also encourage participants to look at C2ES's website, because there are case studies, and one specifically talks about the National Strategies Project. And so that is a resource you can take a look at to see how that ran sort of in print form. And then we also have a separate companion document that lays out funding options. So there are zero-emission truck programs out there, as Kevin alluded to, as well as VW and other federal or CMAQ funding availabilities. So with that, I'd like to start up the Q&A. And there's one question, a sort of broad question, that I'd like to start asking all the panelists. So the first one is, what are the differences between the process of how school districts would adopt electric school buses? And what is that difference between the processes for school districts that currently use other alternative fuels, such as propane, biodiesel, CNG? So how would you compare the health effects of other alternative fuels with electric, and how do the infrastructure needs differ? So since it was health effects first, maybe I'll start off going with Barbara. Barbara, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the Air Resources Board's regulations and the district regulations are really designed to get the dirtiest school buses off the road. So, one of the things that the Air Board is looking for is as much reduction in pollution as possible. So I'll just say that right up front. And of course, looking at diesel versus diesel that is retrofitted versus CNG, you do see reductions, but there still are obviously some concerns even in CNG vehicles. What we have seen is if you modify the diesels and make them cleaner, you do have a benefit for health. But of course, the ultimate is the electric vehicles. So as far as the health is concerned, one thing to think about when you think about exposure to children, I really didn't talk about this too much, so I want to get this point in, is remember exposure is a factor of the level of pollution and also the time that the children are exposed to this pollution. So one of the things that we're always looking at is to try to get the cleanest buses for the longest commute. And this could be a longer commute as far as distance is concerned with some of the rural districts, but it could also be a longer commute of just the time on the bus. And we're talking about some of the problems with congestion in California, and you're probably very well aware of the fact that in the Los Angeles area, you could have children on a school bus as long as at the same length of time as children in a rural community, and yet they're not going nearly as far. So one of the things that the Air Board always looks to, and one of the things that you want to think about when you think about air pollution and exposure in children, is you want to try to prioritize for the children that are going to get the highest exposure, because they're either going to be on the bus the longest and in the worst environment.
Thanks, Barbara. And Kevin, you mentioned about the costs of at least trenching for electric school bus charging. And as I understand, you also have some experience with the operations in comparison to a CNG fleet. Could you speak a little bit about the infrastructure comparison there?
Yeah, it's the CNG takes a really concentrated compressor system located at the facility. They're pretty high cost also associated with doing that. Now, often the person who's providing certain fuels will pay for the CNG infrastructure, but it's pretty comparable to if you had to pay for the entire CNG infrastructure that would be done. The most interesting thing is at the Torrance Unified School District where we ran the program, the school buses actually ran the CNG compressor station at the end of the day. So the CNG buses that were on the lot could actually be refilled. So that's where we reduced the cost of operating the CNG buses by reducing the electrical consumption of that compressor station. So, you can get creative if you have a mixed fleet of buses as well.
And as much as I hate to use the corporate jargon, that's some excellent synergy. That's a really cool use of electric school buses.
Yeah.
So another question then about scaling up, how to get these buses out there. There have been a few questions, and we'll start with Jenna, about what is Bluebird's capacity in the short and long term to produce these buses, and do orders have to be put in a certain number, a certain date, and is there a limit to the number? And then broadly speaking, how do you see the capacity of the industry to expand across the country, and does the industry need to create consumer demand, or will that be there? And then from my own personal question, and to tie in with the health impacts again, are parents and administrators aware of the health impacts of diesel buses? So maybe start with Jenna here, and then if any of the others want to join in, you're more than welcome.
So today we are taking orders for school buses. As I mentioned, our first buses will be delivered late summer of this year, of 2018. Most of those have been out of the California area. As mentioned, we are trying to get the demo bus to as many states as possible. But as Kevin mentioned, if you don't get engaged now with your beneficiary in the states and secure some of this funding specifically for school buses, it's a much harder conversation to have if there's not funding to help purchase that school bus. There is no cap on how many we will produce. We'll keep producing as the orders come in. The V2G technology that Kevin had mentioned will be later this year as well. The Type C bus is actually being launched with that. The Type D it will be an option for. So the Type D is a transit style, the flat nose, if you want to think of it as that. And then the Type C or conventional has a hood in front of you. So I think that answered the first part of the question.
So this is Barbara Weller. So as far as parents and administrators being aware of the health impacts, I think it probably differs across the United States. Obviously, I think California people are more aware of the pollution because of the magnitude of the problem in California, and also because of all of the outreach that is done by the districts and the Air Board and the public awareness. But I think that it's possible that this is not really necessarily nationwide, although a number of organizations are really trying to get the word out about air pollution, and one way to do that is really to get physicians to understand the impacts of air pollution in children, so that they can be aware of that. But yes, I think that depending on where you're at, there may be some area where parents, I think administrators probably more aware, but there may be some area where the parents are not quite as aware of the impacts of diesel buses. So more information is always good.
Okay, and there have been some really great technical questions that have come in. So unfortunately, I don't know that we'll have time to answer all of them. So for the ones that we don't get to during this Q&A session, I'd very much recommend that you get in touch with some of the people, the presenters on this webinar. But one that seemed to come up a few times was about charging rates and the costs. So the broad question is about what was the highest kilowatts used in the pilot projects in California, and does daytime charging result in high peak demand charges? Along those lines too, was there a preference for level 2 over DC fast charging?
Yeah, so on these buses, we had the capability of going up to a 70 kilowatt hour charging. So that's the highest rate we could go at. We were usually running, though, in the 20 range based around the system we had. The rates, that's really going to vary based on the utility territory you're in. And that's where you have to sit down with the utility and talk through it. Some have specific EV charging rates that they'll charge. Some have specific school district rates that they'll charge. And some are, really cooperative in creating a new rates. And so you're seeing that go on in filings. So really sit down and have that conversation with your utility, because it's really going to depend based on the rates they're offering. And again, time of day. More utilities are looking at school buses because they do sit on the national average 85% of the hours of a year, and that's where vehicle to grid comes into really important, is really being able to use the school buses in a variety of different ways while they're parked, sometimes to take excess electricity and be compensated for that when there's too much on the grid, or also to curtail charging when demand gets too high on the grid and be a part of a demand response program that reduces program costs there, or be a storage source to bring in emergency power when needed. So there are a lot of moving parts, and it's just going to vary from utility to utility territory for all of those. And we're doing a lot of that in this Phase 2 project with Bluebird and the Department of Energy. We're trying to get demonstration buses in several utility territories in order to work through a lot of those issues.
Thanks, Kevin. And from a broader perspective, one person suggested that if we were going to take a look at zero emissions vehicles, we'd also be thinking about hydrogen buses. And that might overcome some of the issues with fast charging or trenching and things of this nature. So, Jenna, have you considered, or has Bluebird considered production of hydrogen buses? And Kevin, from a broader market perspective, have you heard of any companies developing the technology for school buses?
No, it's not something that we're currently working on. It's not to say it's something we wouldn't work on in the future. For us, it's really a cost-effective school bus for the districts. Newer technology costs more money, and we want to make sure that we're giving the districts the best bang for their buck. So right now it's not on the table, but it's not to say it's off the table either. So.
And I would echo exactly what Jenna said. Right now, this is the cost-effective way to go because of the technology that exists. And so this would be our recommendation. As hydrogen costs come down, that will certainly be an option, I think, down the road. But now electric is the most viable zero-emission way to go economically.
Sure, totally makes sense. And as somebody who works in electrification of transportation, I see a lot of great updates and developments for batteries. So with that, I'd like to thank all the panelists and the great questions. Kevin, do you have anything to add, or is there anybody who has a last chime to what we've talked about today?
No, thank you, and happy to answer questions via email or phone down the road for those who weren't able to get their questions asked.
Great. Okay. Well,
Same here as well.
Yeah, we'll be sending out the recording of this webinar, I believe, tomorrow to those who registered, and then I believe C2ES will also have the recording on its website. If you have any questions, you have all of our email addresses. So we thank you very much for being able to participate. Have a wonderful afternoon.